So first, I'd like to thank Khaki Labs for this opportunity. I've been following Khaki tours for a long time, and I've enjoyed your walks, and I enjoy your passion for the city. So thank you for inviting me to speak. I also want to thank my partner Anuj for helping me with this presentation because my PowerPoint skills are not the best. So thanks, Anuj. I'm going to start by, and I just want to make this quick disclaimer that I will often look to my right. Please don't be alarmed. I am just looking at my notes, which are on another screen. So I'm going to start by giving you a very quick history of the early waves of migration to Bombay, because these are the communities whose foods I cover in the book. This is not a comprehensive community food history of Bombay. In the book, I look at the early settlers. And then we jump into the main body of the talk, which is structured like a tour, since this is Khaki Tours. So I thought, let's do a tour. And so we'll start from the south and we'll move north. And along the way, I will stop at certain neighborhoods and dwell on food cultures and restaurants. So we'll start with the 13th century, which is really when Bombay's history starts to get interesting. And you have the first real wave of migration that takes place in the 13th century. Now, in the 1270s, the North Konkan, and let's remember that Bombay belongs to the North Konkan. We tend to think of Bombay as this independent city that exists entirely by itself, but it is very rooted in the North Konkan. And so this area was annexed to Devgiri, which is near present-day Aurangabad. And it used to be the capital of the Yadava kingdom. And in 1294, the Sultan of Delhi, Alauddin Khilji, he sacked Devgiri, whose ruler was either Ramdev or Ramchandra, one of the two. Ramdev sued for peace, ended up having to pay an annual tribute, and so on. Now, his descendant, this Raja Bimbadev, left Devgiri after this invasion, and he traveled to the Konkan, and he reached Mahim, and he was so smitten with the beauty of Mahim that he decided to build his capital, which he called Mahikavati, in Mahim. And he really, in his retinue, came the first, the early settlers of Bombay, the Pathare Prabhus, Panchkalshis, Bhandaris, Palchikan Brahmins, etc. So these guys were, really the first migrants to the city. Let's not forget that Kolis have always, since recorded history, lived in Bombay. So Kolis were already, living on the islands. And there's this wonderful quote by S.M. Edwards, and I'm sure, fans of Khaki Tours or local historians know of S.M. Edwards, and he describes Kolis as folks with natural sturdiness that has helped them survive many invasions, and it is true, they've always been around. Right. So this visual, as you can see, this is an old image of the Mahim fort, and it's just used to represent, Mahim, which used to be Mahikavati. Sorry, I'm skipping too fast. Now, following the fall of Devgiri, Mahim was sacked by an expedition, most likely sent by Alauddin Khilji's forces in Gujarat, and thus began the island's Muslim rule. And this continued till 1534, when the Sultan Bahadur had a treaty with the Portuguese, and then you have the Portuguese era. So Bombay has had many eras. You have the Muslim era, you have the Portuguese era, you have the British era, and so on. Over here in this visual, this is also an old postcard. And I collect old Bombay postcards, so this is from my collection. And you can sort of see in this illustration, it's actually a painted photograph. You can see these sort of various natives, these locals in Bombay, and they've been converted by missionaries. And this is, specifically a missionary in Borivali. So 1535 to 1661, you have Portuguese rule marked by mass conversions of the local population. And then you have the British rule. And in this postcard is an image of the Bombay fort. and this boat serenely in the bay. And in 1661, Bombay was given over to the British Crown as part of the dowry of Catherine of Braganza when she married Charles II. And this proved to be, enormously beneficial for Bombay because they'd been looking for another port on the western coast. The British had a factory in Surat, and they were looking for another port. The Portuguese didn't really care about Bombay, to be honest, so they were okay to let it go. And I think later on they must have, sincerely regretted letting Bombay go because it became herbs prima in this. And there was actually only one Portuguese viceroy called Anthony Melo Castro, who told his superiors that you will end Portuguese rule if you give Bombay away, and he was so true. No one saw it but him. So then you have a long period of British rule. In 1661, the population of Bombay was 10,000. By 1675, it grew to 60,000, and you had the migration of Banyas from Surat, Brahmins from Salsette, Armenians, basically people from all around the city. Early 1800s, you had a massive migration from Gujarat, various Gujarat communities. Migration continued in the 19th century, and aside from Indian communities, you had a lot of foreigners in Bombay. You had the Chinese, you had Malays, Arabs, Persians, Armenians, Jews, and so on. And then gradually, very gradually, in the 19th century, that's when you started seeing the birth of a dining culture. And I'm going to very quickly skate through this section because you have Khaki Labs has an excellent talk by Chinmay Damle on the birth of a dining culture in Bombay, and I encourage everyone to listen to his talk because he does such a fantastic job. When a sort of a dining culture came to be, you had taverns for travelers. These were very sort of dubious places run by Parsis called Paddy George or Paddy Goose, and women didn't feel very safe in these taverns. They were just places where sailors would go to get drunk. For the labor classes, people who worked in mills, for example, or in the docks, you had khanavals and bhatiyar khanas. And these eateries were, sort of divided according to community and according to caste. The modern restaurant emerged, and then you also had Hindu hotels for high caste Hindu diners like Madhav Ashram over here, which still exists. And then you had, gradually you had hotels coming up. In 1896, you had the first luxury hotel, which is Watson's Esplanade Hotel. In 1903, you had the Taj. But when I talk about the restaurant, now you had eateries and taverns, but not really restaurant. Like the restaurant means something very specific. A restaurant is about food. It's about having dinner, dining leisurely. It has a certain structure. You have a menu, you have waiters, someone takes your order. These norms didn't always exist. The first luxurious establishment that had all these elements was a restaurant called La Grande Taverne de Londres, which opened in Paris in 1782, and that's really considered the first restaurant. It's only later establishments, such as Green's, which was a hotel right next to the Taj. Currently, the newer wing of the Taj stands in the spot where Green's used to be. I mean, that sort of took the form of the modern restaurant where people went for recreation. You went to listen to music, you went to have dinner, you went to have drinks, you went to have a good time, and so on. So this is where our tour begins. We're going to start far south in Colaba, and then we'll head north. So I'm sure you'll recognize this. This is Link's Pavilion. And Link's Pavilion is one of the very few old school restaurants that exist in Bombay. And it's very sad that we don't have more such restaurants. And I'll come to why we are responsible for this. So in 1826, in the 1826 census, recorded 48 Chinese living in Fort Malabar Hill and Girgaon. No one quite knows when the Chinese first arrived in Bombay. A lot of them arrived, as dock hands, so they worked in the docks, etc. Some of them were traders. By 1872, you had 305 Chinese. By 1890, you had a Chinese cemetery on Antop Hill. And what this tells us is that you had a established community by that time. And the first Chinese restaurant was thought to be Lok Jun, which opened in Kamathipura in 1895. Now, I want to, focus on Ling's Pavilion. I mean, this is, a personal favorite of mine, and it also has a fantastic story. Now, Ling's Pavilion was started by someone, before Ling's Pavilion, you had a restaurant called Nanking. Nanking was started by someone called Yik Sen Ling, the father of the current owners, Baba and Nini. Anyone who's been to Ling's Pavilion will see either Baba or Nini at the front desk. Now, he was from Guangdong province in China, and he came to Bombay in 1938, and he was an antiques dealer. And he set up an antique shop in Colaba, where you have in Electric House, you have this massive antiques shop right now. It's a very sort of modern antique shop. That's where he had a shop. And he sold Chinese curios and silks, etc. And at the time, the Chinese Civil War was underway. It sort of choked the movement of goods between the two countries. And so in the 1950s, he shut shop. And a few years before closing, he started Nanking on Apollo Road. Now, people who are of a certain vintage might remember Nanking. It was this, it was done up in black and red and gold. I mean, this is what I remember. I was a kid when I went there, and it was famous for its ribs. And also, so the story goes, and this was confirmed by Baba Ling, that's where sweet corn soup was invented. So apparently during World War II, a bunch of soldiers, Allied soldiers, entered Nanking, and they had a can of corn with them, and they told the kitchen guys, can you do something with this? And the kitchen whipped up sweet corn soup. So I'm assuming this is true. I don't know how far this is true. It's taken to be true, but it's a nice story to believe. And at that time, there were, several Chinese restaurants in the area. And the reason we don't have too many now is because of the 1962 conflict between India and China, after which, India behaved reprehensively with the Chinese community. Like a lot of Chinese were interned in camps in Deoli in Rajasthan and Ahmednagar in Maharashtra. A lot of them, Chinese, especially those who lived in Calcutta and the border areas, were interned in these camps for 3 years, 4 years, and when they were released, they had absolutely nothing to go back to because their businesses, homes, etc., were taken over by the Indian government. And thereafter, a lot of them migrated to Canada, to Australia, to the UK. So you had a wave of Chinese leaving the city, which is probably why we don't have, the number of Chinese restaurants we should. The other Chinese restaurant here I want to talk about is Nelson Wang, because he gave us, chicken Manchurian. So Nelson Wang was, quite a colorful character, very enterprising. He came from Kolkata in 1950. He was born in 1950. Sorry, he moved to Bombay in 1974 with just, a few rupees in his wallet, and he got himself a job at Frederick's. Now, the spot where Ling's Pavilion is today, it used to be Frederick's. There used to be a restaurant called Frederick's in that very spot. That's where Nelson Wang got a job. And, he got a job there. He did various other jobs. One of his jobs was involved like dancing in a restaurant. And in 1974-75, he was asked to cook at a Chinese restaurant called Chinaman at the Cricket Club of India. And the name refers to both Chinese food and the cricket move, which is a leg spinner delivered by a left-handed bowler. That's what a Chinaman is. And it was here that he came up with chicken Manchurian, which is essentially ginger, garlic, chili, soy sauce, and coriander. And he was really sort of catering to an Indian taste. He was very business minded that way. So China Garden, which is a restaurant that he later founded and which currently exists as CG83, it's known for good quality Indian Chinese. It's very different from Ling's Pavilion, which is more Cantonese and soupy and mild. Okay, we'll move up to Fort. And in this postcard, this is just this old illustration of an aerial view of Fort, and it just looks so beautiful. And there are still pockets of Colaba and Fort which kind of look like this, sort of. So I want to talk about continental, which is basically a hash of British, European, and Indian flavors. And I want to start the story in 1831 with Lord Clare, who was the governor of Bombay, and he hired a French chef. Now, before Lord Clare hired a French chef, the food scene in Bombay was pretty dire. And this is a quote from a travel writer called Emma Roberts. And essentially, she said that, a dining table in Bombay before 1831 was, just a pile of meat. So sirloin of beef, saddles and haunches of mutton. It was just all very heavy British food. And so Clare hires a French chef to cook meals at Government House, which is where the governor lived. And he also taught his skills to paying students. And thereafter, their clubs, Bombay's clubs, began a tradition of hiring chefs from France and from Europe. So Baikala Club, for example, hired a French chef. Baikala Club doesn't exist anymore, but in the 19th century, it was this storied club. And then the Willingdon as well had a series of French chefs. The Taj had a series of French and European chefs, and so on. So it became a practice. And what happened was this, that these European chefs coming to the city, they would pass their knowledge, they would pass their skills on to, local chefs, the Indian chefs who, worked in the kitchens with them. And in turn, chefs and home cooks who worked in the homes of, colonial officials or in the homes of, aristocratic Indians, they imbibed these European culinary traditions. Colonial wives who didn't really know how to cook, but, there was a very rich tradition of cookery books. They consulted these cookery books, they instructed their khansamas to, cook these sort of Western items. And that's how this knowledge was passed down. And what's also very interesting is that not only was this knowledge passed down, this knowledge was transformed. So the Goan chef, for example, and the Goan cook's contribution to Bombay's culinary scene cannot be overstated, because the Goan chef really sort of brought the world to Bombay. And you had a lot of Goan chefs in clubs, in restaurants, and in aristocratic homes. And what they did is that they localized these recipes and just made them more palatable. So, and I want to give you an example of the cutlet. Now, the cutlet, very European item. And this is a recipe from an old cookbook, a recipe of a cutlet. This is how the cutlet was made, possibly in the 19th century. It's a very complex recipe, marinating the fillet of meat in oil, vinegar, onion, garlic, dried herbs, parsley, lemon peel, and then you either grill it or you stew it in gravy, and then you coat it in breadcrumbs, and then you deep fry it. Now, no one makes a cutlet like this. Like, this recipe has not survived, and it doesn't deserve to survive, because frankly, it sounds terrible. But the Indian chef, the local cook working in, homes or restaurants, sort of transform this recipe. And so what you get today is, a spice-filled patty of minced meat that's either crumb fried or, fried in a batter of egg. So you get a nice lacy frill, the lacy cutlet. So these are the restaurants that serve continental today: Gaylord, Gallup's, Cafe Churchill, Mocambo. Just very few places that serve this kind of food, and a lot of them. I mean, these restaurants are in the Churchgate area and the Fort area. That really came up in the 1930s, which is also when Bombay's jazz era kicked off. And so these are restaurants where people went to eat, also went to have a good time, listen to jazz music, swing music, dance, and so on. So this area, we're still in Fort. We've covered the continental places, and now we're going to move to the Maharashtrian snack shop. And the Maharashtrian snack shop, I'm covering sort of the health homes. I'm covering the Uphar Gruhas, places where fresh food was quickly produced, turned around, prepared in hygienic conditions. And according to, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, when people were very hung up about, caste rules, these sort of food norms were followed very diligently in the kitchen. So, for example, Vinay Health Home in Girgaon or Mama Kane Swachh Uphar Griha in Dadar, and these places in their titles, they advertise that they're clean kitchens and that they cater to a certain class of Hindu. Now, one of the most popular items at these snack shops is the vada pav, and I mean, we all love a vada pav. My personal favorite is Aram in Fort. Then this image is, from the kitchen in Aram. And the vada pav is just wonderfully emblematic of the city. It's both ironic and iconic because we would not have got the pav were it not for the Portuguese. We would not have got the potato were it not, for the Columbian exchange. And the pav and the potato were sort of brought to India by colonial powers. They were transformed in the Maharashtrian kitchen, and we have the vada pav. And this is so emblematic of, Bombay's position as, a port city, a melting pot, and so on. So, I always say that I always give the example of vada pav when I talk about what it means to be native, what it means for food to be native, because yes, it is a native item because it was born in Bombay, but let's have a very loose definition of native because it's also from everywhere. Again, another picture from Aram. So let's move slightly northwards to Dhobi Talao, and I'm sure everyone recognizes this building. This is Jair Mahal. And I've chosen Jair Mahal because two communities' histories meet in Jair Mahal, the Goans and the Iranis. Now, the Goans began arriving in large numbers in the 1800s, and the early Goan migrants settled in Kavel, Dabul, and Dhobi Talao. This Goan institute that you see, it's in Dabul. I mean, I wonder how many people know where Dabul is today. But they settled in these areas. There was a thriving Goan population, and they struck out for Bombay either on foot through the ghats or on pattimars, which were these country boats that were driven by the wind. And then in the 1870s, you had the Shepherd and Company, an agency of the Bombay Steam Navigation Company, started a ferry service for ports between Goa and Karachi. So people came by this ferry. And then the hinterland was further opened up in 1878, when you had the development of Mormugao port in Goa and the construction of, a railway connecting Goa with Andhra Pradesh, so people could take the train. And among the early migrants from Goa were cooks, people who are familiar with Portuguese cooking, and that means sort of a Western cooking, and a lot of them had been cooks on ships. So they had imbibed Western cooking techniques and foods on ships. And they fit right into the elite homes in Bombay. And so they knew how to bake bread, they knew how to make a steak, they also knew how to make curries, which the British loved. And the early migrants, stayed in clubs or kuds, and these kuds were essentially sort of organized by village and patron saint. So if you belong to Aldona village, you stayed in the Aldona kud. And Jair Mahal, as of 2019, had 22 kuds. Now, the first known baker, he was, Teresa Albuquerque, the historian, calls him the godfather of Goan bakers in the city, was Vittorino Mudot, and he started a shop in Cavell. He started baking bread in Cavell, and he also started, a hostel for Goans. So perhaps that was the first kud. And this is a picture of Military Cafe, and Goans passed on their know-how, the know-how of baking bread to Iranis. Goans, over time, they got an education, they left the profession of baking, they moved on to become lawyers and doctors and so on. They passed on this knowledge to Iranis. And so Iranis, both Muslim Iranis and Zoroastrian Iranis, became the purveyors of bread and pav in the city. Iranis, as we know, they're responsible for the iconic Irani cafes. The earliest known tea shop is thought to have been started by a man called Khodadad Ashtori in the 19th century, somewhere around the Dhobi Talao area. And in the 19th century, there was a large wave of Iranis coming into the city. They were dirt poor. The ones from the Zoroastrian Iranis were dirt poor. The Muslims were slightly better off. A lot of them were involved in trade. But Bombay at the time was developing. It was there was a lot of change happening in Bombay. In 1896, you had the plague, and in the aftermath of the plague, the city was being reorganized. Causeways were being built, roads were being built. A lot of new real estate came up, and Iranis, and I'm sure everyone knows this story, snapped up the corner shops and started their famous Irani cafes. And the Irani cafe is among the very few places where people across class gathered. And this is something that you absolutely do not see today, because we live in a very fragmented society. You do not have places where people gather, people across class gather, and the Irani was one of the few places where people could do this. So then we move to masjid. Now, I'm sure people who are regulars of Khaki tours know that the masjid over here refers not to a mosque, but to a synagogue. And specifically the Gate of Mercy Synagogue, which is, in masjid, it was it was built by a Bene Israeli called Samuel Ezekiel Divekar in Esplanade, which is around the Kalaghoda area in 1796, and then it was demolished and rebuilt at the current spot in 1860 in the likeness of the Paradesi Synagogue in Cochin. So if some of you have been to that synagogue, you'll see the resemblance. Now the Bene Israelis are, there are many theories about how they got to the Konkan coast, when they got here. But they're thought to have arrived near Alibag around 1600 years ago. And they're thought to have left Jerusalem before the sack of the Second Temple in 17 CE. And over centuries, they forgot their customs, except very few customs like, observing Shabbat. And that's how they were recognized as, a Jewish community. And what I found really interesting about the Bene Israeli community is how they have adapted their kosher adaptations of local food. Now we know that a large part of Jewish custom has to do with the observance of kashrut, which is their dietary law, and they have these wonderful local adaptations. So, for example, challah. Challah is a Jewish braided bread. We know what challah is. And it's traditionally eaten on Sabbath and on other occasions, religious occasions. But in India, Benes really substitute chala with a thin, crisp chapati. Or during Passover, leavened bread is forbidden. So Bene Israelis make a rice bhatri, like a Konkani rice bhatri. And this is really my favorite. The Puran Poli, which assumes religious significance on Purim, which is a Jewish holiday that marks the time Jews in Persia were saved from a plot to kill them, by the king's, vizier. In the world, Purim is celebrated with masquerades and eating something called hamantashen. And hamantashen is a triangular pastry and it's stuffed with fruit. And the Puran Poli is basically this dal filling that's stuffed in roti. And the idea is that it's like the Israeli hamantashen. It signifies the secrecy that was involved in busting this plot. We move to Girgaon. So I'm sure you recognize this. This is Hira Bagh. And just behind Hira Bagh, there's this monstrous building coming up. Now, Girgaon tells the story of Gujarati and Marwadi migration to the city. Now, Gujaratis began migrating in the late 17th century, largely Baniyas, members of the trading community from Surat and so on. They were among the first to arrive. More Gujaratis arrived when Surat declined and Bombay's fortunes rose, and they settled in the Kalbadevi and Girgaon areas. And in the 19th century, Marwadis began arriving in the same area, Kalbadevi, Bhuleshwar, Crawford Market, etc. The early migrants were largely single men who ate at bhojanalayas. And these were, they were called clubs because they had a coupon system. So you bought a coupon, say a stack of coupons for an entire month, and then, you went there and you had a homely meal, and you had a thali, which, gave you 2 sabzis, dal, papad, farsan, chapati, rice, etc., etc. And these were places where you just ate and you left. So, this restaurant, I was lucky enough to go to it. It closed many years ago. I'm sure some of you must have been there as well. It was called Friends Union Joshi Club, and it had seating on only one side of the table. They haven't changed their seating at all. And the idea was you just ate and you left. You didn't sit and chat. So you didn't have benches on either side of the table, just one. Sheet Thakar Bhojanalaya, very famous thali place in the Girgaon area, started not by Gujarati but by a Marwadi from Rajasthan, and he had a very typical story of migrants coming to Bombay in the 19th century. He came to the city at a very young age, like he was 10 or 12. He slept on Chowpatty Beach for days till he was befriended by a cook, from the same community. And that cook got Magan Lal a job at a restaurant where he worked. And it's here that he learned the basics of cooking. And then gradually he sort of, worked in Gujarati homes as a Maharaj. He learned, Gujarati cooking, and eventually worked his way up, bought an existing establishment called Thakar Club, and then turned it into the restaurant that we know today. So, in the same line, almost in the same line as Girgaon, is Bhendi Bazaar, which really is a nucleus of Muslim history and Muslim culture in the city. And you have so many Muslim communities that live in this area. You have the Konkani Muslim, Khojas, Memons, Boras, UP Muslims, Siddhis. It has a wonderful history. It used to be in the 30s, 40s, right up to the 70s and 80s. It used to be a hub for leftist intellectuals. This is where the progressive writers movement met. This is where people like writers and poets and lyricists, people like Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, Sahir Ludhianvi, Manto, Majru Sultanpuri, all of them frequented places in this area. Manto would famously have chai in Sarvi, which is an Irani run restaurant in Nagpada, the north end of Bhendi Bazaar. And here I'm using Bhendi Bazaar in a metaphoric sense, not in a strictly geographical sense. I'm using it as, so when I say Bhendi Bazaar, I mean the area from Crawford Market right up to Madanpura. And it was also home to the Bhendi Bazaar Gharana, like a sort of a musical Gharana. Now, even though there are so many Muslim communities in Bhendi Bazaar, it's really the food cultures of two communities that dominate. The UP Muslims and to a much smaller extent, the Boras. And, I'm sure every Ramzan walk winds its way through Bohri Mohalla, and you'll go to Tawakkal Sweets, and you'll go to Taj Ice Cream and Feroz Farsan. And I want to make note of Feroz Farsan, and this is a picture that you see over here of Feroz Farsan's speciality. It's the patrelia or the patrel biryani, and this really sort of locates the Bori community in Gujarat, the patrel. Like, they love their farsan and they love their meat, and they married the two together to make this very unique dish, which is quite tasty. And there's no rice in this biryani. This is just patrel and meat. And the other spots in Bori Mohalla are, not Bori, but run by Gujarati Muslims and UP Muslims. Surti Barahandi, Haji Tikka, Jilani, and then across the road you have Noor Mohammadi, Shalimar, and so on. And Noor Mohammadi is known for, bringing, also the story goes, known for bringing Nali Nehari to Bombay. And it was started in 1923 by someone called Abdul Karim, who was a native of Sambal in Uttar Pradesh, and which is a region very famous for its food. And Nihari comes from the word Nahar, which means morning. And, it's typically had, I don't think too many people have Nali Nihari in the morning these days, but it was a breakfast item, especially for those who had, who had laborious jobs, etc. And so it's known for its Nali Nihari and also famously for Sanju Baba chicken, which Sanjay Dutt bequeathed to the restaurant in 1986. In 1986, the restaurant opened a new wing. They invited Sanjay Dutt, and he gave them this khade masala ka chicken, which is called Sanju Baba chicken. Right. So Worli. Now, I want to talk about this very unique restaurant called Masli in Worli. Masli is, I think, probably one of two places where you can have a Gaud Saraswat Brahmin non-vegetarian meal. Now, migrants from the Kannada coast, from North Karnataka, and I'm talking about Saraswat Brahmins, Shettis, Mangalorean Christians, and so on, they've had an outsized influence on the food of the city. If we have good idli dosa, if we have good seafood, it's because of them. In Matunga, and we'll see this shortly, you have, your veteran idli dosa places are all run by GSBs, but they're all vegetarian. Masli shows you the seafood and meaty side of the GSB kitchen. They are one of the few Brahmin communities that eat meat and fish, the Bengalis being the other one. So Masli was started in 2022 by Prasad Nayak and his brother Rajesh. They used to run a restaurant called Liberty, like in Udupi, in the same spot. And they have an older restaurant called Liberty, which is opposite a Liberty Cinema, which continues to be in Udupi. And it's quite remarkable that even though they come from the similar areas in Karnataka, the GSB seafood is very different from what you would get in Mahesh Lunch Home. It's very different. So it's quite amazing how, sort of the variations in masalas, the variations in cooking techniques produce vastly different foods. Further north in Mahim, I want to talk about the city's original inhabitants, the Kolis. Now, a lot of the foods of Bombay's early communities are underrepresented in the city. You do not get Pathare Prabhu food. You do not get Konkani Muslim food, Khoja Memon food in the public sphere. You have to be invited into someone's home, or if you're lucky, someone will host a pop-up and you can buy a seat at their table. But these foods are simply absent from the public sphere. Koli food, you have the odd Holi festival that comes up in Versova or Bandra or Vasai, but there was no sort of sustained Koli food place until 2023, when the Mahim Seafood Plaza came up. And the Mahim Seafood Plaza, it runs 4 days a week, and it's manned entirely by women's self-help groups, and it's quite lovely. It's by the sea. They've set up tables and stalls, and you can get, and it's unapologetically fishy. Like, I don't think there's a vegetarian item that can be had there. It's all pretty much fish. So this is a sort of an image of what it looks like. You have these stalls and it overlooks the bay, so it's quite atmospheric. Further north, Matunga, and now I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Udupis in Matunga. Everyone, having a sort of a weekend breakfast in Matunga is really a thing in Bombay. And sort of Matunga Udupis came up at a time when South Indian culture was developing in that neighborhood. Dadar, Matunga, Sayan, these are fairly new neighborhoods. They came up, in the 20th century, in the aftermath of the plague. The local authorities were looking to decongest the city, and this was a new neighborhood. It used to be paddy fields, pretty much, farmed by Agris and Kolis and Bhandaris. And these sort of wide roads and new apartment blocks were built, and which is why Matunga is so organized, because it was a planned neighborhood, and you had buildings with 1 BHKs, and this was the first time that people could move into a 1 BHK. People who are not extremely wealthy could afford a 1 BHK. Now, at the time, there was a lot of migration happening from Madras Presidency, and people would take the train, say a well-educated someone who would train to be a clerk from Madras Presidency would take the train to Bombay, get off the train at BT station, walk into the Times of India building, do a test, get a job as a stenographer, and then go to his family or his friends living in Matunga, and then gradually over time earn enough, save enough to buy a 1 BHK in Matunga, and then bring his family from the south. He didn't have to, live in a chawl with shared toilets, etc. So this is the first time people were able to live with their families in a 1 BHK and not have to share space. And so you had like a large influx from the south, and at the same time it sort of developed culturally. You had cultural institutions like the temples, the Bhajana Samaj, the Mysore Association, etc., etc. And then the early eateries that came up, the Udupis, which were not run by say, Tamils. There's a large Tamil population in Matunga, but the Udupis were run by the GSB community from North Karnataka, and they sort of modeled the Udupi along the lines of a temple. So there was a strict code that governed kitchen rules, kitchen practices, who served, who cooked, and so on. So, people who are very hung up about caste, especially high caste Hindus, felt very comfortable eating in an Udupi in Matunga. And now you have a bunch of veteran institutions that continue to exist, but by and large, a lot of them shuttered as as families sort of got an education, went on to do other things. and so on. So this is an image I'm sure you'll recognize. It's from Cafe Madras, and the landmark institutions are Udupi Shri Krishna Boarding, Cafe Madras, Mysore Cafe, Sharda Bhavan, Amba Bhavan, Ramashrey. I'm sure everyone has a favorite. And now finally, we're going to take a leap, a huge leap to Vasai. And I want to talk about the East Indians. And I could have located this in Kotachiwadi or Mathar Pakadi or Chimbai, which are all East Indian, I suppose, pockets. But I want to take us to Vasai because Vasai has a large population of East Indians. It's very bucolic and very rural in parts, and you get a real sense of East Indian culture. You have, in a lot of parts of Vasai, you have people who live in small bungalows on plots of land. They have their own wells. They have their own banana plantations. It's a sort of semi-urban, semi-rural kind of way of living, and they're really able to preserve their way of life over there. And I think what we don't realize about East Indians is how many sub-communities of East Indians there are. You have the Koli East Indians. You have the sort of upper crust of East Indian society, which is very westernized. You have the folks in between, and Vasai is just a wonderful microcosm of East Indian culture in Bombay. And this is also where you get to hear variations in their language. So East Indians are Marathi speaking, but they also have many words and phrases that are unique to them. And so this image over here is a masala shop called Tiraj, where you get every kind of masala. And, I'm sure everyone knows that the cornerstone of East Indian cooking is the bottle masala. And so Tiraj is famous as a, purveyor of bottle masala, which it depends on, whose recipe you're referring to. It could have anything from 25 to 32 ingredients. But the key ingredients are two kinds of chilies. So either Kashmiri chilies or Byadgi and Madras chilies or Resham Patti chili. So you use a combination of two chilies, and then you have a whole lot of other ingredients. But before I continue, go on about the food, just sort of a quick note about how they distinguish themselves from Goans. So to set themselves apart, Christians of the North Konkan, adopted the name East Indian in 1887. This was in the Jubilee of Queen Victoria, Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. And they wanted to assert that they were Roman Catholic subjects of the crown and that they were native to Bombay. So this name, the East Indian name, sort of signaled this. And it also signaled their appreciation for the colonial government that had, shown that had sort of given the community not preferential treatment, but like a lot of jobs within the colonial administration. And it also referred to the sort of ecclesiastical division of the non-European world into, the East Indians and East Indies and the West Indies. So it's a sort of very loaded, very loaded term. And so a lot of East Indian food is, just really a wonderful amalgamation of Portuguese, Goan, and Konkan influences. It sort of all comes together in East Indian food, and they have a lot of their own versions of Goan food. So the Vindaloo, for example, is called Indial. The East Indians have Indial, and the difference is that they use bottle masala in their, in their Vindaloo. Even their sorpatel is different from the Goan sorpatel because they use bottle masala. And this is not a food that's widely available. Again, you have to order it from a caterer, or you have to go to a pop-up. But now I'm happy to note that there is some movement in this department. You have a pop-up, a regular pop-up called Igorea in Vasai, and these guys, put out a wonderful spread. And if you're willing to make the trek to Vasai, it's absolutely worth it, and you can sort of really get a sense of East Indian cooking at Igorea. You also have a new a fairly new East Indian hotel. So people from the community are finally just putting themselves out there. This image here, it's of this very old bakery. It's called Martina Soup Bakery, in this really, winding leafy lane in Vasai, and it is famous for its coconut cookies. And this here is a picture of Indial, the East Indian vindaloo. Okay, that's it. We conclude with Vasai and the East Indians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pranati. You've taken us on journey through Bombay and through various cuisines. It's Saturday evening, and I'm imagining people whipping up their phones and looking for food options across the many options that you've put out for us. What do you think? We always talk about how, and you mentioned that ODP sort of weighs very heavily in terms of weightage overly. So, what would have been the food scene if ODP food was not there? What do you think would have had more sort of an opportunity to cater to the local palate here?
Oh gosh, I don't know. That's a hard question to answer. Because, I don't really know, because I guess you have to look at the Udupi in conjunction with various other movements, with the influx of migration from the south, with the development of a South Indian culture. So all these things came together. I'm not sure how to answer that question, because, these things rarely happen in isolation. It's various factors, that sort of come together to make things happen. So had there not been Udupi's, I don't even want to imagine it. I don't want to imagine it. Yeah.
True that. So I'll just run through the questions that we have here. Indranil mentioned, I think you had put the date as 1896 for Watson's, and he wanted to know whether wasn't Watson's 1869. Dr. Manisha Talim says that restaurants were, as the name goes, originally meant for places for people to restore. So healing broths were made for people. It's always interesting to go back to the nomenclature and see what they sort of came up with. And she also says that her parents used to go to Nanking since their engagement and thereafter to Links. I think food really does evoke so much of memory for us, right? So many associations that we have with flavors and tastes and places that we have eaten at, and especially special occasions.
Yeah.
I think when you were talking about the Mahim Plaza, the seafood plaza, the Kohli's, Uzma mentioned that it's lovely and very clean as well. So certainly a place for some of us to explore if we haven't
absolutely.
Been there. Adil says that Frenny's opened in Bandra now. Adil is, of course, also a great food fan, and he says that serves East Indian food as well. A lot of compliments your way, both in our private messages and here. Lakshmi Raman says that your presentation was very interesting. As a former Bombayite who lived in Kolaba, she went back in time and learned a lot about the migrants to Bombay. Although eating at restaurants was rare at the time that I lived there, and I think that's changed a lot, as you rightly say, Lakshmi, from the time that a lot of us grew up to now, where food options are just that much more common, and ability to eat and acquire sort of a taste for other cuisines is at its peak now. It wasn't so when we were younger. Though at that point in time, perhaps we ate food from our neighbors and our friends, and acquired a sense of what other communities were cooking. Maria says, thank you for sharing your knowledge so generously. Jyoti has a question. Why do you think East Indians did not get into the public restaurants till now?
That's a question that people have asked many communities whose food is not in the public sphere. And again, that's a difficult question to answer. Some communities um, as communities, they were involved in other trades. So, for example, a lot of the Muslim communities, they did not get into the food business, but they were involved in trade. Like they traded in ingredients and food items, but they didn't get into restaurants. So, why did the East Indians not? I guess some people would say that, perhaps they were more focused, at least, maybe in the 20th century, they were more focused on jobs as opposed to entrepreneurship. Some communities are just more entrepreneurial, like the Gujaratis, for example, and some communities are not. So it's difficult to answer this, but there could be many reasons. In fact, this is a question that I did ask, some people, and this is what I heard, that they were not particularly entrepreneurial, more focused on getting an education and getting those good jobs. Now, whether this is a definitive answer, I don't know. It's difficult to tell because you can only sort of gauge by asking various people. There's no large study that has been done over here, but perhaps that is one reason.
True. Sai Karthik wants to know that your session is very insightful. He says, and where can he buy your book? So, would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
The book is available online on Amazon, and it's also available in bookstores like Trilogy in Bandra and Kitab Khana in Fort. So it's available in bookstores, in Crossword as well, and online, of course.
Do you have a copy of the book in front of you? Would you like to show the cover to people? I'm not sure.
Just
okay. Right.
You want to go ahead? I will reach for it.
Go ahead. Go ahead. You're right, Lakshmi. It really was when we were younger, mostly going to ice cream parlors and snack shops. That's the book copy that Pronoti is showing. In the beginning, there was Bombay Duck.
Yeah.
So that's a book that you can look at. Thank you so much for that. Pratibha says an insightful session, and Jyoti thanks you for the answers. Adil says that gambling at Churchgate was another great place, and we did talk about that, Adil. Lakshmi Raman says she loves the title of her book. Ravi says vegan restaurants are now emerging across the globe as more people adopt to plant-based lifestyles. And is Mumbai also embracing this trend? And do you have some good vegan restaurants and recommendations in Mumbai?
Bombay is definitely embracing, this trend. You have a lot of vegan restaurants. I don't know if I'm the right person to recommend because I'm not vegan at all. Like, I'm a unabashed non-vegetarian. But I hear that Greener, if you're into cafe style food, Greener has great options, and Earth Cafe, which has several outlets across the city. It's in Bandra, it's at Churchgate, it's in Juhu. They have very good vegan food. I've actually had some of their food. It's quite nice. These are the two that I can think of offhand. Yeah.
Thank you. Compliments for your book as well. Archana says that the book is fantastic and had a tough time putting it down. It's available on the publisher Speaking Tigers site.
Yeah.
And Akshay agrees with your selection of Earth Cafe, with your recommendation of Earth Cafe, and says it's a great. So lots of compliments. Uzma says thank you for a wonderful session. She's added a few more stops to the annual Muhammad Ali Road food trip. And also, I think she echoes many people in saying that she's feeling rather hungry now and is looking for a delightful dinner this Saturday evening. Jyoti, and a lot of compliments for the book title as well. So, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for joining us on this very delectable talk. Thank you so much, Pronoti, for this delectable talk. And we will meet you either in a restaurant or over your book in another time, and look out for everyone else next Saturday as well. Thank you so much.
Look forward to that. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone for taking time out on a Saturday evening to listen to me ramble on about food. And I apologize if I've made any errors in dates. It's entirely possible I might have. But all the dates in the book have been fact-checked and vetted, and they're all correct.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.